Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Field and Garden with your friend Lisa Mason Ziegler. And it is just another beautiful fall day, and I'm just so inspired. And I really want to share with you guys today in the episode what we're doing here on my farm, what's planned for 2025. And I just can't wait to bring you in the loop. And I think it's going to inspire you if you feel like you don't have enough space, because I think you're going to find out after this episode that you probably have plenty of space. Okay, so before we dive in, just want to remind everybody that this podcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com, where we have a fully stocked online garden shop that has seeds, tools, supplies, my books, our online courses. And I didn't know if you were even aware we have a sister podcast called Seed Talk with Lisa and Lane. Check that out on podcasts, wherever your favorite place is to listen to your podcast, as well as we just have plenty of free resources there for you. And friends, I don't know if you've heard yet or not, but we have a shopping phone app. Think QVC, but with me talking about our tools, seeds, and supplies and how we use those, as well as that whole platform was brought on board so we could share the weekly harvest with you. That's where you're going to see what is coming out of my garden as it comes out of my garden each week, week after week. So I invite you to download the app from your phone's app store. Just search Gardener's Workshop. It is free, works like a gem. You can watch replays there. And then try to join us on a Friday at 12 noon Eastern time to catch the show live. And we have a lively conversation that goes on with the live viewers. Anyway, it's just a ton of fun. And we're just trying to get the word out all about it because we feel like it's the best kept secret in gardening and farming. All right, friends, so let's talk about this secrets to growing more cut flowers in less space. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions of flower farming, because I had it too, is that you have to have a lot of growing space, and nothing could really be further from the truth. Now, let's just add a little note there, and it also depends on totally what you want to do. I know many growers that are growing in a small patch in their backyard because they wanted to do a 10 or 15 bouquet subscription to pay for their family's annual vacation or something. It's all about what you're trying to do. For me, on my little small city farm, I've always been into the most production I can get out of my property because I sold in a lot of different markets. So you have to keep that in mind. I just wanted to mention that. And I am a small space farmer, and I have been successfully doing it for over 2.5 decades. And I was forced, because I'm pretty much landlocked. I'm in the middle of the city, and I'll mention how I got a little bit more land in a moment, but my only real option was to hone my skills to get more flowers out of less space. And friends, I really discovered some amazing things that not only is that, why wouldn't everybody do that? But anyway, so let's talk about my growing space first, or my growing situation. So our whole property, when I started farming, when I first married Steve, the total property was 1.17 acres. That's less than 1.25 acres. That included our home and several outbuildings. I mean, we had 1, 2, 3, at least 4 or 5 that were here from the days of his grandparents, as well as some newer ones. So the property was a little chopped up. I actually had one, and it was really smaller than 1/4 acre, one that was kind of in our side front yard, and then the other one was in the backyard. And so I had a total of about 1/2 acre when I launched my flower farming business. And then what happened to us is we got the opportunity, I guess it was 10 or 12 years after I started flower farming, to purchase, believe it or not, 1.5 acres that adjoined our property. Because what you have to really understand, if you've ever seen some of the drone footage of our farm, my little farm is 100% surrounded by houses now. There used to be, up until about 5 years ago, a 40-acre horse boarding farm on one side, and that now has 85 houses. So when we were able to purchase that acre and a half over a decade ago of that farm that is now houses, I mean, it was just a dream that I never even allowed myself to think about. I never thought we'd be able to buy it. But anyway, so that brought our property up to 2 3/4 acres. And again, we still had those same number of buildings, but some were rebuilt and built bigger to meet our needs. And so I do feel like I was much more equipped to handle that additional land because I had been farming already for a decade and a half. But I will tell you, this led me down a very, very interesting journey and discovery. So back to before I had that extra acre and a half, when I was farming on those two, we're going to just call them quarter acres, although I highly suspect they were smaller than that. Back when I was just farming on those 2 quarter acres, I was primarily the only person working the garden, right? And that was, by the square foot, the most productive time of my entire career. I squeezed more out of those 2 small gardens than any other time. So I was producing like 4,000 to 5,000 stems of flowers a week. And I'm often asked, how in the heck did you count them all? Well, friends, in fact, we did. Because my primary market was florist, we had to invoice the florist. And if so, we sold flowers by the bunch. So we would print invoices, which means that I can then run reports. And we could see what we were selling every year. And then you have to know what your shrinkage is. Shrinkage is what gets thrown away, y'all. And you can come up with that number. But we were producing, bottom line, a ton of flowers from those 2 small spaces, right? And I'm not trying to say don't expand. I'm just saying you may not need to expand, or if you're just starting out, you may not need much more space than you have, because this is the bottom line of more space, and you just don't appreciate this until you have it. You know, when I didn't have much space, all I did was dream about having more space. And then once I got more space, there was just a lot more work that had to be done just to keep it, to maintain it, keep it mowed, or to keep it implanted, or you know what I mean? It's just not as dreamy as it could be, unless of course you grow your business along with it and get more help. And not everybody wants to do that. And I totally get it, right? So the difference between me in the beginning, that first decade, and me once we expanded was that I learned that my efficiency was at its peak when we had less space. And why do I believe that is? I believe that we, or me, I keep saying we, I had to make choices each and every day. When you don't have much space, all of a sudden, every day you have to decide, what am I going to grow? What am I not going to grow? What am I pulling out? I mean, you have to make choices. You can't just do when you have more space. It's like it is just so easy to keep adding and adding and adding. And that's what's happened. That's kind of where I am right now. You know, we stopped high production about 4 years ago. And so since then, I'm not running at full capacity for the garden space I have available. And that has just led Bobo and I to like plug in something here, plug it in there, grow more. Oh, let's try this color. Oh, we forgot to do this. It's a little more relaxed, and we're living the not so great fallout from that. Things just kind of get missed or forgotten, and that just didn't happen when we were on a smaller space because you had to focus. So I think that that is a huge benefit of actually having less space. And so I want to just tell this little story. So I've told it before. Many years ago, probably when I was in my probably between 5 and 10 years in, I went to a ASCFG, that's the Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers. They used to have regional meetings, which we do it again now. They come and go. Anyway, oftentimes they would be on somebody's farm, right? That was the big benefit. Not only did you get to go learn something from a program, but it was on someone's farm, so you got to see how they do it. I mean, seeing it is believing and doing it, right? And so, of course, back then there were no other flower farmers within an hour of me. So I asked my sister, who had just started helping me. She was working the farmer's market for me. And so Suzanne and I packed up, and it was about 3 hours away from me. And it was like we left early in the morning, got there, did the program, then had tours, ate, and then you turn around, come home. Well, when we were on the tour, Suzanne, whispered a few things to me. It's like, there just doesn't seem, this is a big farm. It was 10 acres and the flowers were really spread out. And so Suzanne, who really had no knowledge to base flower farming, and she had a landscape, but she wasn't really into all of that. So she said, it just seems like we have as many flowers as they do, but theirs is just really spread out over a wide area with really wide pathways, which have to be mowed, which take a lot longer to mow. And, she and I really came away that day kind of affirming us. And of course, I hadn't expanded yet. That's when I was wall-to-wall flower garden on our property at that point. I didn't have a tractor, so that meant my gardens could go almost up against our fences, and I was growing as much as I could from every square inch I had. In any landscape I had, I would incorporate cutting woodies, like that's where all my hydrangeas came from. And the observation that we came home with that day is, why would you grow multiple acres when you can grow probably the same volume on 1 acre? It's all about growing intensively and focusing on your soil. And I'm going to review some of those things that I do here in a moment. But I felt personally, when I first started farming, I felt very penalized because I was a city farmer. I couldn't have tractors, couldn't have a greenhouse, didn't have a bunch of acres. I always felt embarrassed about that when I would meet up with other flower farmers. But what I have gone full circle seeing now is that is perhaps the greatest gift of my little city farm. Is it forced me to not go bigger and bigger and bigger and get involved with more and more to take care of. Because that syndrome that we all have in January, when you start looking through seed catalogs and your eyes are bigger than your garden is, and it's kind of like overfilling your plate, and then you have to eat it all. It's the very same thing with farming. I mean, it is so easy to order more perennials and more woodies and more seeds and more plugs, and then it's all got to be sold, it's all got to be tended, it's all got to be weeded and fed and staked. And having a small space, in my mind, is a gift. So do not feel penalized. You just have to hone your skills, and we are going to talk about that. So the 2025 goal here on our little city flower farm is that we're really returning to the roots of our success. I've downsized, I've squeezed down my working cutting garden back down to what I think we need for the actual production that we need, which is primarily for education and to show on our show on Fridays, right? And so we're squeezing it down. And that's kind of where we're headed. And I'm really looking forward to just that journey. I'm already excited about it. And so I want you to be excited if you have small space or you want to return to a small space. The things that I'm kind of focusing on is really limiting what I'm growing. If you listen to Lenny Larkin in her course that talks about profitability, you can find that over on our website. I mean, she really talks about only growing like 15 crops. And it's so scary to think that, but she proves that it's more profitable for your business. So we're limiting what we grow. I am, much to my sister's dismay, but she doesn't harvest anymore. So baby sisters, you know how they are. Our pathways are getting narrower, and I am really getting back on the ball about using flower support. Because let me tell you something. When space is tight, you do not want flowers falling into the pathways that are now going to be narrower. And then also, I'm really tightening my belt on crop flipping, and I'll talk about all that here in just a minute. So let's just start. I've kind of pointed out 4 different areas, and I'm just going to run through and give you some tips. So the beds. So here is a revolutionary thing that I have found over the last 2.5 decades is that I grow the same volume in a 30-inch wide bed as I do in a 36-inch wide bed. So for many years, I actually started out at 48 when I first started farming. The older you get, the narrower your beds get because it's harder on your body to have wider beds. But I was stuck at 36 for several years. But when I got a tractor 10 years ago and started making beds with an implement, that bed maker only makes 30-inch wide beds. And guess what? I just put the same thing I was growing in the 30-inch beds. So you can grow the same thing. Saving that 6 inches, let's just say you have room for 10 beds, that's a whole nother bed in a pathway. So my beds are 30 inches and my pathways are getting narrower again. So I started really narrow because I had so little space. And when I say narrow, they were probably 18 inches wide. We don't carry buckets down the pathways. We walk out to the harvest trailer for several different reasons, but it's just the person with their big handful of flowers that needs to go in and out of that pathway. So narrower pathways are a huge benefit. Again, you might be able to get an extra bed when you make your pathways narrow, because let me tell you something, y'all, there is no money growing in the pathways, right? And also, I will get back to mulching my pathways instead of allowing vegetation to grow. When we went to wider pathways, like 24 to 30 inches, we mowed them, right? And that was no big deal. But when you narrow your pathway trying to save space, the mower won't fit down there. I mean, you could weed eat it, but that's a lot of weed eating. So, and of course, mulching really build your soil. And for me personally, landscape fabric is not an option. Not only does it suffocate soil, it is a huge maintenance issue. Here in the South, weeds grow on top of it and through it, and we have to sweep the landscape fabric after every harvest because when it rains and there is debris on the landscape fabric, it turns into mush, and not only does it stink, but it is really slippery. So mulching our pathways, because they're so narrow, it doesn't take nearly as much mulch, and it builds our soil at the same time. And the other thing, I'm always thinking about is how am I managing weeds, right? And so for us, I use Bio 360, the biodegradable film, on all of our beds that are being transplanted, which is 90% of everything I grow. I only direct seed a handful of crops, cool flowers, in the fall. I do not direct seed any other time of the year, and it's about efficiency and space saving and higher rate of success. So I'm always thinking about that. And then I'm also thinking about at this time is how are we going to be removing crops in these beds, once they're done. These are all things that as I'm thinking about beds, I'm always thinking. So that what that means for me, because I can manage I have a walk behind tiller, which is what I started with. I still have it and use it. And I have what's called a compact tractor. My tractor, if I make those pathways, I'll have to weigh this. And this will be part of our process that Bobo and I will look at, especially as we build the cool flower garden this year. If I make the pathways as tight as possible using my tractor implement making the beds, those pathways will probably be more like 24 inches because that's where the tractor tire goes. But what that means, the trade-off for that is that I can tear down one bed in the middle of a bunch of beds on either side with the bush hog it, till it, and then remake the bed with the tractor. That's a huge labor saver. And it just really depends on what equipment you have. If I was a no-till, that might not be that much of a deal, right? So it really depends on your method of farming. And then the other thing that I'm really thinking about, and I've gotten really lax about it, y'all, I'll just be totally transparent, is using flower support netting. Because we're not selling our flowers, I'm like, when are we going to get to netting that bed? And you know what? If a few stems go down, oh well, we have enough for what we need, right? But when you narrow your pathways and you start squeezing in as many flowers as possible, having them stay in their own space is key. So using flower support netting helps to control crowding, pathways, and other flowers. So those are things that I'm thinking about and I'll be incorporating in the bed building, bed thinking part of my operation. And then the next thing, which, if you've been around me very long, soil is the top billing. And the soil has to be, when you're planting intensively, as we do, we always have, your soil has to be in tip-top shape. And there's a lot of different methods and ways to do this. And I'm not saying that what I do is the only way by any stretch of the imagination. You just find what works for you, for your physical limitations, for your equipment, for what's available to you. All those things matter, right? So first off, the first thing may be that you may need to start with a soil test. If you don't know the status of your soil, if you're not soil testing periodically, you're gardening and farming with a blindfold on. You really don't know what's going on in your soil, right? That's like a report card. So that may be the place to start. And I prefer to do that in midsummer, so you get it back in time to make some corrections before fall. But you can really do a soil test anytime. It's when you can actually then implement anything suggested is the next question, right? And a lot of this soil building really depends on that style of farming that I was talking about. There are folks that implement no-till. There are people that do low-till, which is kind of where I'm in that middle place. And then there's conventional, and those are people that just really do a lot of tractor work on their gardens. I mean, I hate putting my tractor on my garden, but at this stage in the game for us, for what we're doing or what we've been doing these last decade, that was the only way we could have done it. So if you have to figure this part out for yourself. You don't decide you're going to be a flower farmer today and then because you can, you go out and buy a tractor. I totally recommend you start building beds by hand. I did that for 12 years, y'all. We used a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and then we went to using a walk-behind tiller, and then I graduated to a tractor. First off, not only did I build the foundation of my garden that we grow in now, with an amazing foundation to build on. And then it just got easier every year. So those are things you have to kind of work out, but you do not need a tractor. You do not need a walk behind. And so another piece of this, building and keeping your soil in tip-top shape, particularly because we're trying to squeeze blood out of a turnip, right, y'all? Is that practice of adding finished compost or leaf mold or like worm castings, which you can't nearly get them in the volume that you would need for this, that you add those every time you replant. That might mean incorporating it. It might mean using it as mulch that it then breaks down. But you're constantly feeding the microbes in the soil. Those are the players in your garden. They're the ones that are taking care of your plants and delivering all the nutrients, the moisture, keeping them happy and healthy. So at every flip, and a flip is when we take an old crop out and replant the next crop, we always add. And I particularly recommend using dry organic fertilizer at every flip. Now, if we were talking about landscapes, I'd say, prepare your soil well, put in some fertilizer and plant your stuff and mulch it and take care of it. Keep it weed free and mulch it every year. And you know what? Most plants do fine. We are in a whole different ballpark trying to squeeze as much. We're constantly planting and pushing them to grow and cutting flowers. And we're basically, we'll think of a straw in a milkshake, and you're getting to the bottom of that cup and you have got to refill it. And that's what organic matter and organic fertilizer feeds the microbes in the soil. Non-organics don't do that. They actually can damage those workers, as well as it just feeds the plant and just leaches away. So the other thing I'm thinking about to preserve all this is what I'm covering the bed tops with, right? To prevent those annual weed seeds from sprouting. And, the biodegradable film is what we are deeply entrenched in using because of its weed prevention that we've experienced with that. And that just helps us to preserve our soil and to keep the weeding from being needed. We do, you definitely need to think about irrigation. Irrigation on a farm is so much less expensive than what people think. Y'all, people just get all tied up and caught up, get their britches in a knot, really going overboard with stuff. We use T-tape. Yes, you need to use a filter. And T-tape and the fittings, you can use it from year to year if you're not using it with a tractor. It's very inexpensive when you consider how little water it uses, as well as how it will improve the quality of your plants. And we'll put in the show notes a couple of vendors that we use, and they're the people that help you figure out what you need. They're tutorials, and it just makes all the difference in the world. And again, if you're going to grow intensive, you have to feed and water, right? So Dave Dowling often says so many of the questions that he gets, particularly about people that are growing so many dahlias and what I call high investment crops that are risky business. You really have to have customers and know what you're doing. He says almost every problem that he hears from people, it involves one of two things. He has to tell them, you've got to water more, or you got to get rid of the bugs, the pests. And so it's really simple, y'all. It's not rocket science. When you do the basics, you prevent so many problems. All right, so planting. So I call it intensive planting, and I can tell you guys, I see so much wasted space when I scroll through social media and just see what people's beds look like. And it's like, I think to myself, holy cow, I could fit like 5 times the number of plants in that same space. From the layout to the spacing that they're doing, you really have to gain some knowledge. You have to not be out there guessing, y'all. And so planting, you try to have some uniform length of your beds. And so having your beds grouped together, maybe in 1 or 2 spots on your property, or maybe in one area, and conform and lay them out so that they're all the same length. That just makes reusing, thinking row cover and netting. And if you're making beds without a tractor, you can reuse irrigation from year to year. So having that uniform bed length is really helpful. And there's just a lot of reasons why that is super helpful. And we plant almost exclusively by transplant. I mentioned earlier that I would say I bet it's not even 10% is direct sown. I bet it's more like 5%. Everything else is transplanted. There's a better rate of survival. There's less labor involved. You get better uniform spacing in the garden, which means you get the maximum amount of plantings. You don't want holes in your bed, y'all. When you have small space, you cannot allow that to happen. And I'll add this in. This is not in my notes, but I often hear from people. Now, if you're a home gardener, there's nothing wrong with doing this. But when you jump and you're a small space flower farmer, you make that jump to starting a business, you cannot rely on reseeding. You can't say, oh my gosh, these plants look so good, I'm going to just leave them here and let them go till next year. Because then you have created a spot in a bed that you can't really prepare for a complete planting, but yet you have these spotty plants throughout. I never understood all of this until you get into needing more flowers and you have a small space. There's reasons that people do the things that they do, like pulling out entire crops, even though they may look all right, but they aren't. They've done their production. We'll talk about that in a minute. But people don't understand why I transplant even zinnias and sunflowers. And why is it? We get a better stand of plants. I get them quicker. I get them more uniform, and I get more from the same space that people that direct seed, that have to thin and weed. There's reasons for that. You really have to trust the process that the successful people that have gone before you have kind of mentioned. When you're starting out, you need to follow the leader. You can then experiment, but not until then. So we plant intensively. You just have to really do research and make notes. And I'll tell you that it says really clearly in our instructions and in my books and in my courses about what spacing is, but we still see people not following that lead or asking that question. And you really have to learn when you decide to grow a certain plant. That's the first thing you got to find out. What is the spacing on that? The big difference is there's single stem plants. That means one bloom per plant, like a sunflower, some coxcombs. Stock is that way. And then there's branching plants. Two totally different planting patterns, right? And I squeeze till they scream. That means I am all about squeezing more plants in until they scream. And how do I know when they're screaming? Disease and pests or puny blooms. And you would be surprised how tight you can put some stuff. But that's what my spacing recommendations are on successfully planting as a cutting garden, right? And here's another one. I only grow proven cut flower varieties. You know, this seems so simple, y'all, but I see it every day on social media. People asking about, what about this flower or that flower? And I again want to say there is nothing wrong with doing that when you're a home gardener. If you're truly starting a flower farming business, you do not have time to do that stuff. You are wasting precious time wondering about that. And you also I see a lot of people foraging. There is a time and a place for foraging legally, but you don't ever want a client to look at something you're selling and think, I see that growing in the ditches. And we have heard that complaint about growers from customers when I was out in the market. So I only grow in my working cutting garden proven cut flower varieties, right? That's all about helping to limit. So now I'm going to share what I believe is the superpower of small space flower farming. Okay? And that, my friends, is as simple as succession planting. And this has been the key to my career of getting a ton of flowers from a really small space when you think of what I've done. So when we expanded our farm, got that extra property, then my working garden went from that half an acre, it tripled to 1.5 acres. And what happened was we then were producing 10 to 15,000 stems of flowers a week in season instead of 4,000 to 5,000, right? So we were getting a ton of flowers from a small space. And the only way I was ever able to do that was by succession planting. And succession planting just basically means that you are not planting your entire space at one time. You organize and plant. I like to think of it as in 3 different times. Fall plant, which also includes very early spring planting of cool flowers. Then I have a block of beds that we do our first spring planting. Then I have a block of beds that we plant our second warm season tender annuals. And by the time I fill that space up, guess what? Cool flowers are done. That's where your third. So there's a very easy, simple, organized method to do this. And when you practice succession planting, you produce more flowers over a longer period of time from a space. And guess what, friends? Here's the best part. Plus, you get diversity. That means, when I plant that first warm season tender annual, like for me, that's mid-April, I'm planting for hot summer flowers, bright jewel colors and just hot pink and all those colors. That second planting, a lot more of those sames, but I'm also starting to think about those are going to be blooming late summer and into fall, thinking fall colors. Then that third planting that I do where cool flowers is finishing up, oh my goodness, tons of grasses and all that fall stuff that people really want. So I create from this small space this diverse offering that people have no idea how little a space I grow in. Because I will tell you, when our florists used to come here, they walk around with their mouths open. Like, you grew all that you bring to me here on this, and it's succession planting, my friends. You can change up the colors, you can change up the varieties. So here's what you have to do to be able to do this. You have got to gain knowledge of how to incorporate warm season and cool season annuals for your conditions. And this is so much simpler than we make it. And once again, I want to say, backing out to 30,000 feet above your garden, looking at the big picture, and think of those 3 blocks that I just mentioned, and think, okay, if this was my fall, very early spring, and this was my first spring, which is your first warm season, and this is my second warm season, just break out to that and start thinking with that mindset. Now, this is so much easier to incorporate and actually practice when you also do this with seed starting. We start seeds 11 months out of the year. We truly could start 12 months out of the year, but I take December off. I'm the seedling caretaker here on this farm, and so I don't want babies to take care of in the month of December, right? So when you are continually seed starting, which means you continually have seedlings that need to be planted, it really helps you to do what I'm getting ready to tell you about. And that is, you have to extinguish crops as they've given their best and their time is over. And I struggled with this for years. I am the worst for saying, oh, Bobo, I don't know. We did get how much of a bucket did you get? Did you get 2 buckets or it's like I'm standing there hemming and hawing, wasting her time, my time. We end up leaving the crop because we still think it might give us a little bit more. But let me tell you what happens when crops start to wane a little bit, when they're not just pumping out the flowers and the vegetation is happy and healthy and you've got a beautiful canopy. Weeds start creeping in. Stuff starts happening. And then it grows into a bigger problem than you ever thought about. Plus, guess what? You're not getting as many flowers as you thought, and they aren't the quality. They start getting smaller. The blooms do. Maybe they're shorter. Maybe there's a little bugginess starting to happen, because if you let the weeds creep in, then the bugs or the pests that perhaps hang out on some of those native weeds start getting into your flowers. And practicing the tough love of saying, the first time you're harvesting a bed, right? You're cutting, and you have to not. When I'm cutting, I've got the flower stem is on the plant, my hand is on the bloom, and I'm pulling the stem a little to the left as I'm reaching down to make the cut. That's when I am looking for the next bloom that I'm going to cut. That's why I am such a quick harvester, amongst other things. But if I haven't found a flower by the time I snip, pull the stem up and strip it and go to make that next cut and do the same thing over again, that's the time that bed should be gone. That's when production is waning. Now, it's different if you haven't had rain and all of a sudden it rained and now you're thinking, you know what, by next week this bed ought to be kicking again. But we have learned that every time we think, what if, we leave it, never typically pans out, So you have to practice tough love and practice succession planting, because when you have seedlings waiting in the wings that need to be planted, I'm out there in my mind talking to my plant saying, you better hop to it or you're going to be out of here next week. Do you know what I mean? It's like everything changes when you have seedlings waiting to be planted and you start practicing that. Whether you agree with it or not at first, you are soon going to realize you are going to have more flowers of higher quality for longer, and you're going to create more diversity by getting rid of crops that just have given you their best. They're done. Doesn't mean that there's no blooms out there. It just means that it isn't their best anymore, right? So remember that succession planting also spreads out that workload from that seed starting to preparing beds to planting and harvesting. Just so much good comes from it, y'all. So instead of having to start a bazillion seeds, you only have to start a quarter of a bazillion seeds. And that means you don't have to get all the beds ready at once. You just have to get this area ready for planting. It just spreads everything out. But you have to practice that tough love. Why would you not? It's not like you're getting shortchanged. You've already gotten as many flowers as you needed from that planting, right? I'm going to wrap it up with this and say that a lesson that I learned from years and years and years of farming and growing and going to other people's farms, I was definitely guilty of being judgy of other growers that mowed crops quicker and sooner than I thought back then that they should have. Isn't this the way it is, like with young parents and new teachers and young doctors, they know better than the old guys, right? We all fall victim to this. And that's what I can remember walking around a farm and thinking, oh my gosh, you're going to mow that? You could get stems from that for a couple more weeks. Look at all those blooms there. Now I totally get it, y'all. But I just want to say, I was totally that person. And I think most people come in to this flower farming gig because we were all gardeners to start with, right? That goes against the gardening religion, right? There's still flowers. It still has hope. That is not when you are a commercial grower, and particularly if you are a small space urban farmer like I am. So friends, now I get it. It's less work with better yields, with better quality to replant plants that have already given you their best. That's when it's time to just pull them out, put them in the compost heap. They're going to contribute again, but just in a different way. That's when it's time to replant. So friends, those are my tips to maximize your space. You can really get more out of a small space than you ever imagined. I believe that we get more from a small space than we get from a large space per square foot when you start figuring it out. And I just think there's nothing but opportunity for small space flower farmers, because I would be willing to say that the lion's share of people that want to get into flower farming do not want to have it be their whole life. I do have many peers that are husband and wife teams that have built these tremendous farms, but that is the exception instead of the rule. Most people are just looking to create some additional income for their family, doing something they absolutely love doing, which is gardening, and ramping it up. But to do that, friends, and if you want to do it and do it successfully, you have to learn it's very different than gardening, farming is, producing is. And I'm just glad to be here to help guide you if that's the path that you choose to go on. I'll help you either way. But it's two very different pathways. So friends, glad you were here with me today. I'm super excited about what 2025 holds for the Gardener's Workshop Garden. And I just can't wait to squeeze more out of less around here. Ciao.